The Pentagon spent $366 billion were obligated to contracts. That's 54% of DoD budget. And that's 7 times the UK's Ministry of Defense budget. And that's just one department. The Department of State is also a huge consumer of contractors. Now, of those contractors, now a multi-billion-dollar industry, the amount that is armed is only about 10 to 12%. Only 10 to 12% were armed. So you think of Blackwater and Nisour Square in 2007, where Blackwater guards killed 17 Iraqi civilians. That was only about a minority of contractors. Most contractors do very mundane things like cook chow and fix vehicles and build buildings, et cetera. But about 10 to 15 either kill or train others to kill. And this is the group that I focus on in this book, which I call private military companies, PMCs. In Iraq, over 50% of the force structure was contracted, 50%. That means there was a 1-to-1 ratio between troops and contractors. In Afghanistan, it was closer to 70%. Over half of the US force structure was contracted, raising questions as America dependent on contractors to wage wars and sustain wars. One question is, how did this happen? How did half of the force structure become contracted? Well, it happened very simply. When policymakers took the decision to go to war in Iraq or Afghanistan, they did not envision, for whatever reason, that this would be 2 long wars. And they quickly realized that the all-volunteer force could not sustain and recruit enough volunteers to fill all of the billets. So they had some pretty terrible policy decisions in front of them. The first was withdraw, which would have been politically unviable, premature leaving Iraq and Afghanistan. The second was to assume that allies would fill all gaps, which is an unreasonable assumption. The third option is to have a national conscription, a national draft like Vietnam, to fill all the billets. That would have been political suicide. The fourth option was simply to contract out the difference, which is what they did. There is strong bipartisan support in Capitol Hill for this, one of the few things. So there are 4 trends. First of all, the first trend is resiliency. Multi-billion-dollar industries do not evaporate overnight. They look for new clients, and that is going on today. So rather than, we have a national military model that when wars were done in Iraq and Afghanistan, like Vietnam, they come home and they demobilize. For some reason, policymakers think that this industry will simply do the same thing, it will go bankrupt. It's not. It's looking for new customers, which leads to the second trend. The industry is becoming more international and it's proliferating. Prior to the last 10 years, the US has been the primary consumer. But now it's no longer the primary consumer. Now it's a much more of a free market. So companies that once worked just for the US government are now working for oil companies. They're working for humanitarian organizations. They're working for all sorts of people. We don't even know who they are. Also, other countries are using them. Putin is allegedly using Chechen mercenaries in eastern Ukraine. We are seeing Nigeria hiring mercenaries out of South Africa and parts of the former Soviet republics to kill and go after Boko Haram. And by press reports, they are succeeding. We are starting to see also Latin American ex-Special Forces soldiers show up in Abu Dhabi and the Gulf states, doing we don't know what, working for the Gulf states. We're seeing contractors, armed contractors in Erbil in Iraq, defending oil company assets. So we're seeing a lot of contractor activity, and these are not, again, the book is not about contractors who cook soup. It's about armed contractors or those who train armed contractors. We're seeing them everywhere. We're seeing also them proliferate amongst other domains of warfare. So not just the land domain, but also sea. We're seeing arsenal ships sitting off the coast of Somalia and the Gulf of Guinea in Africa that protect freighters from pirates. And the way this works is that you have an armory ship it's an arsenal with armed contractors, and if you have a freighter going through pirate waters, they will helicopter that security called embark security and put them on your freighter. And they will defend the freighter with firearms until you're through pirate waters, and then they get helicoptered back to the arsenal ship. We're starting to see contractors use drones, unarmed drones, not the expensive predator types, but cheap ones that you can get online. It wouldn't take much to make them suicide kamikaze drones. We haven't seen contractors go to space, although space is privatized, begin to privatize as SpaceX. But in the fifth domain of warfare, cyber, we see mercenaries there in this thing called hackback companies. And the way that works is if you're like your Anthem insurance company, or you're a competitor of Anthem, and you just saw Anthem Insurance get hacked, causing them great distress. And you're like, well, I don't want that to happen to my company. Current US law does not allow companies to play offense in this country. You can't go after hackers. So some companies have thought about hiring offshore hackers to hack the hackers that attack them. Not to get back their lost information, but to frankly whack them, and hopefully that'll be deterrent. So if you have hackers from Russia or China looking at your company and they know that you have a hackback company behind you, maybe they'll pass over you and go to somebody else. So we're seeing it proliferate. At the same time, the third trend is we're seeing it go native. It's indigenizing. Warlords in Somalia and Afghanistan and other places are now fashioning themselves as private military companies and selling their services, their militia, to companies, to humanitarian organizations, to the US Army. The US Army, in fact, hired warlords in 2010 to protect convoy resupply routes in Afghanistan. Which leads to the fourth and final trend. We are now at a precipice in the world right now. There are two different types of these companies in the book. There are what I call military enterprisers, which are not mercenaries. These are companies like DynCorp and Blackwater and Triple Canopy and others who they don't deploy armies, they don't deploy private armies, they augment big national armies. And they train other armies like the Iraqi army. But they themselves do not have offensive capability, they themselves do not wage war independently, they don't do maneuver operations, etc. They augment a strong army and they work in a public-private partnership with those companies, with those governments. And they can do a lot of good, especially for stability operations. So that when we think of contractors in Afghanistan, that's what they are, military enterprises. It's a term that comes from the 30 Years' War. There's a precedent for this in history. Now, the other alternative, the other crossway, are mercenaries. Mercenaries are what we see, when you think of mercenaries, it's exactly what you think of, right? These are for-profit, private actors who can wage war. It's what Nigeria's hired to do against Boko Haram, allegedly. These companies can do fully automated military maneuver operations. And they are less fickle. They don't have a private-public partnership with anybody. It's a true free market for force. Most of military history is privatized. And we have to think about what that would do, because right now we live in a world where states nominally should have the monopoly of force. But if force becomes a commodity, if conflict becomes a commodity, and mercenaries appear, and anybody who can afford the means of war could wage it for whatever reason they wanted to, we're going to have more war. Not World War II and III, but these low-grade, persistent wars that never seem to end. Also, mercenaries are a commodity where they can create their own demand. They can engage in racketeering. They can go up to a city and say, give us all of your gold, and we won't sack you this month, as they happened in the Middle Ages. They can, when out of work or unsupervised mercenaries, become predators, become brigands, or become pirates if they're Navy privateers, Pirates of the Caribbean in the 1600s. So this world that I lay out in the end of the book is a sort of what I call durable disorder. It's a world order that can contain problems but not resolve them. So in this world order, which I call neo-medievalism, because it sort of looks like the medieval order, we're going to the status quo ante of the Westphalian order of today, of states, state centricity. We're going to see a commodification of violence, where anybody who can afford the means of war can wage it. We're going to see more mercenaries emerge. We're going to see new consumers emerge. Anybody who's very wealthy, could be powerful corporations, could be oligarchs, they're going to be new consumers of this force, of this, like an armed corporation. We're going to have contract warfare. It's like contract killing, but with armies or navies. And lastly, and most importantly, this is a world that will have more war in it. You're taking an industry invested in conflict, and it's going to go to the most conflict-prone places in the planet. And who's going to stop that? The United Nations, the US? Is the US stepping in right now in Nigeria? No. People are watching Nigeria very closely, because if it succeeds, then somebody might hire mercenaries to go after al-Shabaab. Or al-Shabaab might hire them to go after somebody else, Uganda. So we will wait and see how this unfolds, but the purpose of the book is to raise some alarm in a non-reckless way, and also look at some of the good things that this industry does. For example, they could augment UN peacekeeping operations if done well. But bring attention to it and to sort of say, we're beyond Afghanistan, we're beyond Iraq. This is something that should concern all of us. One of the more disturbing aspects of this industry that is shared today as it was 1,000 years ago in the Middle Ages is that linking profit motive with warfare encourages war. It encourages companies to expand and elongate conflicts. It encourages them in some cases to start conflicts. Now, we have not seen that recently, but historically we have a lot of precedent in the Middle Ages for that.